Hello, apologies I can't be with you in the lesson today. I'm currently isolating at home while I wait for my wife to have a COVID test result. Hopefully I'll be back in time for your next lessons, all being well. Now today you're going to be doing the summary task of B10, so that is pages 22, 23, 24 and 25. And it's looking at extended answer questions for talking about the nervous system and how it responds. Now, on the first page, you've got some information about how you answer those questions, what each word means. For example, if you're asked to explain something, first you need to describe it and then say how that helps it. For example, if you were asked to explain polar bear adaptations, you'd first describe the adaptation, so they have white fur, and you'd say why that helps them, so they have white fur to be camouflaged. It's all things like that. If it's just describing, all you do is say a polar bear has white fur. It's also got compare questions, evaluate, determine, justify, plan, predict, use, or write. These are all terms that they can ask on these extended answer questions. These ones look like a lot of writing, but once you understand how they work, they are a little bit easier to get all 6 marks on. So looking through the tasks, you've got various different tasks where you're asked to go through and see what they've done. Task 1, you are looking at 2 student responses, seeing how they've got their marks, and you then need to write your own answer to try and get all 6 marks using what you've seen there and identified. Task 2, the answer there has got 6 marks. I know on the paper it says awarded 1 out of 6, but that would be all 6 marks. And that's describing a reflex action and how it helps. You've got to come up with your own mark scheme for that one to see what they've done to get all 6 marks. And task 3, you're going to write your own answer using what you've learnt so far. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just talk through one that is similar to task 1. Instead of having a mouse, we will have a person touching a hot pan and seeing what happens. So what happens, rather describe what happens when a person touches a hot pan. And we're going to look at in terms of the nervous system. So first off, with our nervous system, we always start with a stimulus. Now, stimulus is our change in environment. Now, in this case, touching a hot pan, it is the heat. We've got heat or temperature from the pan. And that's detected by our receptors. Our receptors in this case are the nerve endings in our skin that detect heat or pressure. So nerve endings in skin. So we have the stimulus, which is our change in the environment, in this case heat. Our receptors, which detect the stimulus. So these detect stimulus. Our receptors detect the stimulus, and these are the nerve endings in the skin. And they will send the message down the sensory neuron. A sensory neuron is, or sensory nerves, the nerves are obviously the bundle of neurons, they will take the message from the receptor towards the CNS. So they go from receptor to the CNS, the central nervous system. And it's going to carry it as an electrical signal or impulse. When it gets to the end of the sensory neuron, it needs to go to the relay neuron, but it has to cross via a synapse. So the synapse is the gap between neurons. And it's going to go across as a chemical message. So we get the neurotransmitters, neuro relating to the nervous system, and transmitters, they will transmit the information, and they diffuse across the gap. So they diffuse across the synapse or gap, and this is a chemical message. We now reach what is called the relay neuron. So the relay neuron continues that message, it passes it on. And for this part, we need to think about where we're going to be going. So we've touched a hot pan. This is a reflex arc reaction. It's happening quickly to keep us safe, keep us out of harm. We don't want to go to the brain to process that information to make a decision. We want it to happen as fast as possible. Obviously, the message still will go to the brain. We will still get it. We still know that we've touched something hot, but we get the reaction before we are able to process the information. So the relay neuron, it goes from the sensory neuron to our motor neuron. And again, it's an electrical impulse. We've gone from an electrical impulse in the sensory neuron to a chemical impulse or message in the synapse, going back to an electrical impulse in the, I'll move that across a bit for you there, in the relay neuron, and we get to the motor neuron. Before we get to the motor neuron, we have to cross another synapse. And again, just like this one, it's the gap between neurons, and the neurotransmitters diffuse across the synapse. So we've got there the gap between the neurons and the neurotransmitters diffuse across the synapse, and again it's a chemical message. At which point we are now back to another neuron. This one is the motor neuron. And the motor neuron is going to go from our CNS, where our relay neuron is, to our effectors, which in this case will be our muscles. Could also be a gland, depending on what our response needs to be, but it's going to be a muscle or a gland. In this case, it's definitely a muscle. Get or gland in there, depending on the response. We go to the CNS to the effectors, which are our muscles, and this will then produce a response. They tell the muscles to contract. So our effectors, which are our muscles, most likely in our arms in this case if we've touched it with our hand, and it will tell them to contract. Now that contracting our muscles will move our arm out of the way. If I contract my muscles in my arm, I can move my hand. Our response is to move our hand or leg, arm, whatever it is that's touching it. We'll do it as move our hand away from the hot pan. We've got here all the steps that we need for writing a response for describing this is a reflex arc reaction. So we'll write it up here. We've got reflex arc. It's a reflex arc because it's going via the relay neuron. It's not going to the brain. So not going to the brain to be processed. And it's there to help keep us safe, protect us from danger. So it keeps us safe, and it's a faster response. We've got all of the things here for describing how a reflex arc works. Now you'll notice there are more than 6 different steps on here, but we've got 2 synapses. The synapses are the same thing. All we have to do is to say the synapse is the gap between neurons where we've got them. You might want to lay out your answers slightly differently. You might want to say what happens and then describe everything each step, or you may want to write first we have a stimulus to change in the environment, in this case heat. The stimulus is detected by the receptors, which are nerve endings in the skin. They detect the stimulus. The receptors send an impulse or a nervous signal down the sensory neuron, which goes from our receptors to our central nervous system, and it's an electrical impulse. You may also want to talk about how the neuron has a myelin sheath. To help insulate it. And that will speed up the message. We have the synapses, which are the gaps between neurons, so between our sensory neuron and our relay neuron, and our relay neuron and our motor neuron, and they contain neurotransmitters which diffuse across the synapse, and they are chemical messengers. We then have the relay neuron, which goes from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. Again, it's an electrical impulse. Again, it's got that myelin sheath, which insulates it to speed up the message. We have another synapse. We go to the motor neuron, which goes from our CNS to our effectors, which are either muscles or glands. Again, it's an electrical signal, or electrical impulse. Again, it's got the myelin sheath to insulate it. The effectors, in this case, for moving out of the way of a hot pan, are our muscles. They'll get told to contract. So the response is then we move our hand away from the hot pan. Now the last task you have to do is looking at whether someone can detect a stimulus, that painful stimulus of the pin poking them. This time the information does go to the brain, but if they can't detect it, there is something going on somewhere that means they can't detect it, potentially an injury to the spinal cord. Okay, I hope you have a good day and are able to do the task. Please work well. Again, apologies, I can't be there with you, but I know you will work very, very hard. Have a great day.